for those courses in African American document experience, and those of you from the ancient world will be available in the back at the end. I want to thank Dr. Shields for spearheading this event and for including me in the program. In the introduction to the latest edition of Equiano's narrative, Professor Robert Allison states Equiano's purpose for writing his narrative is simple: to convince his readers that he was a decent, ordinary human being that did not deserve to be enslaved. And from this premise, the reader is led to understand that no one deserves to be enslaved. Now, essentially speaking, this is a tenet inherent in our 21st century understanding. However, remember, as Dr. Shields pointed out, that Equiano's intended audience was primarily abolitionists who were working to end the slave trade in the 18th century. Although of same purpose, there were obvious differences between Equiano and Wilberforce. Equiano had experienced and witnessed the unconscionable horrors of the institution of slavery. Therefore, for Equiano, it was not enough to end the slave trade. He wrote to end slavery. Although not explicitly stated, Equiano inverted Wilberforce's strategy. He reasoned, if government complicity, sanction, and enforcement of slavery ended, there would be no need for the slave trade. His narrative is set in the context of what I call the first era of modern globalization. The transatlantic slave trade became the foundation of mercantilism, the dominant economic system of the time, in which European nations fought each other over control of the slave trade. Ships laden with goods from Europe headed for the west coast of Africa, and these goods were traded for human beings. Now, this occurred after the decentralization of the great and wealthy medieval West African kingdoms. The newly emerged kingdoms of the Ashanti and the Dahomey established themselves as an integral part of this global system. They traded their prisoners of war, their neighbors, and soon anyone they could capture to the Europeans. The Europeans needed this human labor to mine the gold, silver, to man the ships, to service the trade, and later to produce the raw materials of their new world colonies. The leg of the trip that carried the enslaved to the Americas was known as the Middle Passage, and graphically articulated by Equiano in his narrative. Once in the New World, the enslaved were subject to horrors equal only to those depicted by Milton in his Paradise Lost, and this is brilliantly brought to our attention in Equiano's narrative. The raw materials produced by the enslaved were sent back to Europe for sale and manufacture, and then the process began again. And Equiano's travels and labors from Africa to the New World, including the Caribbean and North America, back to Europe, and even to the Arctic, are a first-hand account of this globalized system. The wealth generated from this exploitative system created the wealth of nations, as it financed European wars, the establishment of their colonies, the industrial revolutions that would facilitate the second era of globalization, and indeed this era of globalization in which we live today. Equiano's narrative, first published in 1789, the year the United States Constitution declared all men equal, is one of the best, if not the best, of the slave narrative. For its historicity alone, Equiano helps us understand not only the slave trade, slavery, early abolition movement, and globalization, but he bore witness to the battles of the 7 Years' War. He heard Whitefield preach and inspired the Great Awakening. He saw the American colonists' response to the Stamp Act. He visited Philadelphia, which would become the sentinel of antebellum abolition. He tells us about 18th century seamanship, including expeditions to find the Northwest Passage. He witnesses the transmogrification of the colony of Georgia from this workers' utopia to a slaveocracy. By all definitions, it is indeed a great book. I often compare Equiano's journey to that of Odysseus. In Aegeus 200, The Course in the Ancient World, those students who read the Odyssey for the first time, they want so desperately for Odysseus to just get home. Why can't we just get home? This is something we can all relate to. It is the same for Equiano. The reader wants him to be free. Today, fortunately, we can only theorize and analyze the praxis of racialized slavery, that peculiar version of man's inhumanity to man. We use the theoretical frameworks of agency, hypo-descent, racial construction, racism to try and help us understand. We analyze the institutionalization of rape, stereotyping, we look at labor and community systems, and still it's very difficult to imagine the life of an enslaved person. Equiano's narrative mitigates this difficulty for us. In reading his story, we feel, we empathize, we root for him to get his freedom and to be able to hold on to his freedom, to be allowed to live as a decent, ordinary human being. Like all slave narratives, the authenticity of the narrative is questioned, primarily the controversy surrounding his birthplace. This issue came up at the time of publication to discredit him personally, to discredit the narrative, to discredit the crusade to abolish the slave trade. And today scholars have presented new evidence, as late as 2007, that he was not born in Africa and thus could not have experienced the horrors of the Middle Passage. Does it matter? I contend I don't care. And I know that sounds flippant coming from an historian, one trained in the veracity of historical documentation. But the narrative serves its purpose then and now. Then it was a tool, a catalyst, like the fiction of Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Slavery as an institution, most did not actively participate in it, even though they benefited from it. And that group preferred to know as little as possible about slavery. And those who did actively engage in the trade and engage in the maintenance of human bondage preferred to think of slavery as a necessity or a necessary evil. Yet Equiano's story puts a human face on slavery and puts slavery in your face. The part of the narrative of most question is about his African home. And whether they're his memories or the memories of others, it helps the reader to understand the commonality of humanity. He wants the reader to understand that he came from an ordered society where laws and customs were honored and obeyed, and as a child, he was protected as much as possible. But most importantly, his narrative about his home tells the reader that he was loved, that he was reared to be a decent, ordinary human being, and therefore still worthy of love and compassion. This is a principle that we all must remember, that we all should understand, that we all should adhere to. The act of being human makes us all worthy. Dr. Shields, well, I'd like to give one quick commercial. I just received confirmation today that the Council on Post-Secondary Education has officially approved the Bachelor's of Arts degree in Africana Studies. So if you're interested in this type of content, you can now major in it. Thank you. And Dr. Shields will introduce our presenter.
Thank you, Dr. Shelton. I have a bit of a human interest story here to introduce Brian. My wife and I decided to have a sort of a last little getaway vacation prior to the start of the academic year. And we both have a great interest in historical fiction, history, and so we decided that we would stay at the Golf House in Louisville and visit